So, Trevor, do you have a... do you have a remote switch or... Yeah.
Right. And if you want a pointer, this one right here.
Probably not.
Good afternoon. Let's get started. Let me start with a couple of announcements. Our speaker next week is going to be Mike Jackson. Michael Jackson is his actual name. He is a partner at the Wesley Group based out of San Francisco Bay Area. He will talk to us on effective approaches for clean tech funding. Are we there yet? In many ways, this is a continuation of a talk we had a couple years ago by Ashmit Shidana, who was a partner in Foundation Capital, where he came in and talked to us about what's going on in the VC industry. And then I asked Mike to tell us what has happened in the last 2 years. How has the VC industry come around and realigned to make more productive investments in the energy sector in the last couple of years? We do have a sign-up sheet only for the students who are registered for this course. So this is a surprise roll call. Trevor will pass it around, and if you're registered, please make sure that you sign in. If you do not, then we'll take you that you have missed all 15 classes the entire semester. We'll not do that, but please sign in. All right. Trevor, please remember to close the door. And then with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Paul Hudson. Paul is the co-founder and managing partner of Stratus Energy Group. He started Stratus a few years ago, and Stratus has really been at the center of engaging in a large number of important energy projects with a large number of stakeholders across the country. Before co-founding Stratus, Paul was a state energy regulator for about a decade, including 5 years as a commissioner and chairman of the Texas Public Utilities Commission. He has held many positions with the governor's office, including the director of policy for the governor of Texas. He currently serves on the Department of Energy's Energy Advisory Committee, where he was first appointed by Secretary Chu in 2012 and then reappointed in 2014 for another 2 years by Secretary Moniz. He has held many important positions, including having served on the board of directors of ERCOT. And in 2009, very appropriately, the American Wind Energy Association awarded him the National State Leadership Award for his pioneering work with the Texas Competitive Renewable Energy Zones that we all are very familiar with. Please join me in welcoming Paul.
Thanks, Dr. Rai. He and I didn't prearrange that introduction. I usually keep it much shorter than that. I appreciate your time. So I spent many years as an undergraduate on this campus, more than I care to admit to, in fact. I took Introduction to Aerospace Engineering many years ago across the street in this brick building from Colonel Drury, and have many fond memories of being on campus, although the facilities have improved to a significant degree, I think. It's natural, I think, when you're in your 20s or 30s, and we have people that I think stretch maybe just a bit beyond that in the group as well, to look forward in your life. And when you think about looking forward to family or to career or to opportunity, it's the most natural thing. And for me, I've reached my 40s, and it's natural when you're in your 40s not just to look forward, because maybe half your life is gone, yes, but you also look backwards, and you ask yourself whether you've done consequential things in your past, I think, and you look forward to trying to do consequential things in your future. And so when I think back on my time at the Public Utility Commission, working for the governor, I asked myself these questions. Did I do consequential things? What will I do that will be consequential going forward? And when I come and speak to audiences, I also ask myself the question, which audience members will be consequential and will do consequential things? And your frame changes over time. You know, the first career that I had, and I'm on my third career, was a member of the fire department in Austin. My second career was a high school teacher. And my third career was as a policymaker. And maybe your frame of reference is doing something consequential for yourself or your family, maybe your community or your state or federal level or even on a global level. But a little bit about this talk is my belief that we're really at a point of crossroads. And so let me commence. I really have these photos up here because I took them all and I'm quite proud of them. I've got just a few. These photos are pictures of big infrastructure. And I have them as a frame of reference for the class to understand the investment that we as a country have made in something that we depend on daily. And it's an extraordinary infrastructure. I've had the opportunity to be inside nuclear containment and on a coal plant site and on a natural gas plant site. I went out to the Abengoa solar facility, which has these solar troughs that go 16 feet in the air and a mile long, one after the other, row after row in Arizona. They're so strong and so powerful, and this isn't a picture of them, that the secondary reflection has melted a whole series of porta potties and the wheels on a series of vehicles out there. It's just extraordinary. This is a battery infrastructure out at No Trees. It's a very large battery. This is a waste plant in Munich, Germany. This extraordinary infrastructure is the basis of so much of what we do, and it's so important. And for 17 years, the better part of 17 years, I've made it my life's work. And I find it, I have a great passion for the particular pieces of the industry that we touch. And in fact, close to my heart actually is a certain bit of this infrastructure in West Texas. So let me commence to talk about things that I think are consequential, if we might. So in 2003, the National Academy of Engineering, you can read this yourself, called our engineering achievement to be the most significant achievement in engineering in the 20th century. And why not? I mean, we have almost 7,000 power plants in the United States, 19,000 generators, 1,063 gigawatts. And every minute of every second, every second of every minute of every hour for 8,760 hours a year, you've got people caring for this. In fact, the Weaver Combined Heat and Power Facility right behind us here is at work as we speak, caring for this on all of our behalves. And each and every day, important to me as a capitalist, is $1 billion changes hands in this industry every single day in the United States alone. Every single day. 450,000 miles of high voltage lines. And it's fueled our growth as the world power, I suppose, that we are in the 20th century. You just look at the statistics around petroleum use, hydroelectric, coal, wood, fueled in just this incredible engine of economic growth over the course of the last 115 years. And you look at this GDP chart, the United States relative to the rest of the world, and you have to say that we've done well, yes? And in the last few decades, when we've been given good reason to care about these types of issues, we've done well on the basis, I think, to a degree, of trying to decrease levels of pollution in the environment. I don't say we're perfect. I think we have a ways to go. But we've done this while continuing to grow economically in general, and we've done this with efficiency largely, and I use this only as an example. This is an efficiency chart of refrigerators and the relative size and the relative efficiency standards over time, and we've been able to do, I think, some things quite well on that basis. And there's a testament to the work that has gone on in the industry for the past 100 years. I think some people find it abhorrent. I actually find it quite beautiful myself. Here's the rub. We're very lucky, but not everyone is quite so lucky. 620 million people in sub-Saharan Africa lack this basic access. More than our own population lack basic access in India. And of course, in the poorest nations, we are obviously the hardest hit. 60 million people in Congo without electricity. 70 million in Ethiopia, 93 million in Nigeria. An extraordinary challenge. And unfortunately, one that isn't improving much. You can see the statistic here. We've continued to increase penetration rates, but our growth rates of population have outstripped penetration rates of electricity. And so I think a defining challenge, as it were, for me and perhaps you, if you choose to think about these issues, our generation, is this issue, is how do we care about this issue? Well, we care about this. And so I want to talk about that just a bit. These are energy consumption rates, and obviously China and India, rising powers, the United States, an existing power, a little more efficiency over time, continues to grow. And as we see this economic growth and this development, it comes with difficulty, yes? 1.2 million premature deaths in China. And we can't just sort of pull up the economic ladder. I mean, we've spent the externalities of the United States around all of these environmental issues for quite a long time. And we can't pull up the economic ladder behind us. 94 million people could have been fed by crops that were destroyed in India by smog alone. And if you look at our emissions of greenhouse gases, and you know that there's a few of us with an R behind our name that are willing to spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'm willing to talk about it. This, I think, if you believe the science, and I actually do, presages great difficulty, especially when you couple it with this, right? Kyoto set out a set of goals, and we've had many tangible steps by many countries to step forward with taxation or using other types of cap and trade systems. And you see a raw map, I'm sorry if I'm standing in your way, of many of these systems that have been put in place. And yet all you'll see for us, of course, is the northeastern United States and California, a little bit in Washington and Oregon. But elections matter, yes, elections matter. And the president in 2009, please read this, digital lines, harness the sun and the winds. He was a little more clear in 2013 and suggesting we'll respond to the threat of climate change. And whatever you believe about the president and whether you supported him or voted for him, and I voted today, in fact, he's done what he said he was going to do. And these are all the things that the EPA has promulgated over the course of the last few years. Most importantly, I guess, this June 2nd proposal for rulemaking that has a year tail period to it while they take comments from the public is front and center in the industry right now. All of the debate over 111D. And of course, it's a typical fight, and I'm not going to read these, but obviously there's quite a bit of distance between the Wall Street Journal and Krugman from the New York Times. I'll give you a minute to just adjust the quotes there. Most of you are grad students, you're fast readers, I think, yes. And this is the 2012 results, and one of my underlying theses for the talk today is that we have to find a rational middle. The second thesis is we have to speed innovation to extraordinary degrees to be able to care for this and this and this. And so let me talk about that for just a bit. Elections matter. New York Times. This is Tuesday this week. And you can see that on my right, your left, ads are starting to pop up. When I worked for the governor, we've always said people didn't vote on the environment. We didn't worry about that vote. But there's an increasing, I think, number of ads being aired about the environment. This analysis suggests 146,505 ads. That seems pretty precise to me, but it's the New York Times. And some are on the pro-coal side, as you would expect, in West Virginia and in Kentucky. But these issues are beginning to move boats, and I think it's an interesting observation to make that there is a belief in the political community that posturing in this election ahead of the 2016 election is meaningful. So, my humble opinion, I think we're at a fairly rare historical crossroads as a country. And let me explain why I think we are. So on the 23rd of September, you all, I'm sure, are aware that there was a convention by the United Nations of a climate summit, as it were, and India and China weren't present. The next round of negotiations toward a new international treaty are about to begin. And they follow a similar framework to Kyoto. And you can read these two quotes around equity and around developing countries being given full consideration. And the reason why I think we're at a historical crossroads is that we have this internal U.S. debate about 111D that's going to unfold contemporaneously with this debate that's happening around the next generation of Kyoto. And I think if that debate goes in one direction, perhaps we end up with the moral authority and leadership to help push that a certain direction. If it ends another way, maybe we don't get to say that we want to go forward. And I think it puts us in a difficult place. But again, pulling up the economic ladder behind the United States is not the answer, in my opinion. So difficult work ahead. So why I feel passionate about this space, and Dr. Rai has explained that this is a multidisciplinary background, is that I find that the clash of physics and engineering and law around these problems and the technology is just, it's fascinating. I mean, to have a product delivered on the spot, on time, every second of every day, AGC signals, I mean, it's just an extraordinary set of things that go into it. And I care about these things, and I admit freely, you know, this $48 trillion figure is kind of intriguing to me. It's an example of the type of capital that will be required to spend over the coming decades to be able to keep up with growth. And so we should talk about how we work this way, okay? So there's two things, again, that I think are required at this point in time to be able to care for those three things. And one is, the development more of a political middle, more of a compromising set of principles. And two is innovation. And I want to spend a few minutes about that. This sector is a difficult sector, I think, in many ways to innovate in. We've seen great progress in wind and solar and storage and stuff. But there's this fragmentation in the industry, right? 242 investor-owned utilities, munis, cooperatives that cover portions of the U.S. and scale is very difficult to get to if you're trying to sell to an end-use set of customers because the set of rules are different in Texas and California, et cetera, et cetera. So let's talk about this just for a moment. Because as a former regulator and a former policymaker, I spend a lot of time thinking about where new technology collides with the rule set. So when we got approached by some storage folks back 4 years ago, we went over to the ledge and helped write statute and helped write administrative rules and helped write ERCOT protocols to be able to effectuate storage market entry into Texas. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about the clash of new technology and how it interacts with the rule set, as it were. And, I think it's fair to say that for decades, very few industries have had this overhang of regulation and the regulatory capture that creates these real barriers to entry for new market participants. And I think it's compounded in some ways. This is great graphic, I did it myself, is we have no single organizing principle nationally around electricity issues. There is no organizing principle. I suppose we prefer, because this is what we have, many, many different organizing principles. And, this is one set of organizing principles. These are FERC jurisdictional and, of course, ERCOT organized markets and not. Obviously, the southeastern United States and that big gap in the west. But even these FERC organized markets differ widely from one to the other. PJM is different than MISO, is different than SPP, is different than the Cal ISO, is different than ISO New England. It's different than New York ISO. And so there's no real uniformity in how we implement wholesale markets in the United States. And of course, we have a significant geographic portion, if not significant portion of our population that has self-governing cooperatives selling at the distribution level. Again, many states have no regulatory fiat or authority over those folks at all. We have some areas of the country that are organized with retail open access, some effectively, some perhaps less effectively. It's quite stagnant. And of course, this is the mismatch of different investor-owned utilities across the United States, and the various regulated utilities all have a mind of their own, frankly, about what our future should look like. And fragmentation creates a great deal of difficulty in policymaking. Some states with renewable portfolio standards, some with energy efficiency resource standards, very limited number of states with some type of carbon regulation, carbon trading regimes. And so if I can crashly sort of sum up 3 decades in one slide and then 3 more decades in one slide, there was a golden era, and I'm telling you sort of the bad news here. There was a golden era of utility regulation where utilities actually wanted to sell more electricity. They would advertise, ready kilowatt. Obviously, they would try to get a significant number of new customers and fueled a lot of economic growth over time. Very financially healthy industry. In the 70s, sales growth slowed, and 3 Mile Island occurred, and the input prices destabilized quite a bit. In the 80s, there was sales growth, but there was the beginning of excess, EWGs and IPPs and others. Capital cost overruns really drove some lack of confidence in the industry as a whole, and we began the process of restructuring the industry. So again, go back to the fact that our organizing principles in this country have developed over time in such a way as to be extraordinarily disorganized. And, one might argue that we were headed toward a path of relative organization toward retail and wholesale open access as an organizing principle, and that was derailed almost entirely in 2001. On the wholesale level, obviously, it continues. There's still some states with former retail competition, but it's quite limited. And I think this is a fair summary of the pervasive sentiment today. Uncertainty about the industry structure, a feeling amongst the regulated that the regulatory compact is starting to break, downward trends in sales growth, the rise in certain disruptive technology. And here's an example that I wanted to put up on the board. If you look at 91 to 2007, ComEd, PECO, Baltimore Gas and Electric as 3 examples of regulated utilities, show 1.4, 1.5% growth, and we expected that we would see that. But if you look out into the future, these guys are seeing a bleak future, as it were, and I think it's fair to say that this causes one to think, well, where is this next generation of billions of dollars of investment going to come from here in the U.S., perhaps internationally? Allowed ROEs also on the decline. Credit quality of the industry it's getting worse. You saw perhaps that Barclays downgraded the entire sector back in May of this year. And power prices actually are making new build quite difficult in all of the organized markets, including ERCOT. Disruptive technology is emerging, although, a fraction that looks like 12 gigawatts over 1,063 doesn't seem to me to be an immediate existential threat to the industry. It's legitimate, but I don't think quite an immediate threat. And I do think there's this sense in the industry overall of waiting till all of these rules are finalized and put in place. And it's probably worth noting that 25% of the fleet is over 40 years old. And so, again, go back to the thesis of historical crossroads. We are going to repower in the United States. 25% of the fleet is 40 years or older. What are we going to put in its place? How much should we emphasize diversity? How much should we rely on the shale plays that are declining, or dropping down the cost of natural gas? Now, I want to say that on a more positive note, I think those are a little bit downbeat. There are a lot of smart people thinking about a lot of these issues in real time, not just this class. These are all efforts around the United States. This is an Energy Foundation slide, it's not mine, that are talking about what the future of the industry should look like in the U.S., both nationally and internationally. And having had the opportunity to participate in some of these forums, I can tell you that there is an incredible amount of thought going into the structure of the industry going forward and the types of things that we ought to be caring about. There's other reasons, I think, for some hope. I was talking to Trevor and some folks beforehand, Eric, I think, about clean tech investment, and the federal government obviously has spent a significant amount of time trying to prop up the industry, as it were, during a very tough time. And there is a lot of thought happening on sort of the side of the substation down to the end-use customer that really has never occurred before, right? We've got a dumb grid, kind of intelligent in the transmission network and at the GenCo level. But there's an incredible amount of discussion going on from that substation all the way down to the end user right now, which I think gives us some reason for reasonable forward hope. And the entrepreneurial sector, I think, has responded to that. You can see this is an ecosystem of various plays out there. Again, not my slide. I think this was Gartner Group or something like that. But there are an extraordinary number of interesting companies, many of which I watch and follow and think about in terms of market entry. And of course, again, we're at this relative advantage time, and these are hub gas prices, and you can see, well, we've had this nice trailing curve with all of the fracking activity. UK, Germany, and Japan have been less fortunate. And it seems to me logical that we should make investments in expensive things when power prices are low. My thesis. Energy imports, this is a similar mirror slide to the other one, but you can see that since 2007 roughly, we've had a decline in crude oil and petroleum imports, and this nice increase at the other side on natural gas, coal, and other types of energy exports. The trends on solar are good. The technology on wind is getting better. It's the rotor size actually over here, and the relative efficiency of turbine production. And all of these other things, I think, are reasons to be hopeful about the industry. If the early slides around smog in China and India are depressing ones, I think this is a hopeful slide. We have this very interesting set of companies. When I pull my iPhone out of my pocket now, there are SDKs on Apple for managing my home. Some of the most emergent companies on the tech side have started to turn their attention to the sector, and so I think there's some reasons for hope. So let me just finish with a couple of slides, because again, I think the two buzz things I would ask you to think about after this presentation, besides doing something consequential, and I hope you will each choose to do something consequential, is that it's extraordinarily difficult in the utility space to move the needle. And here are some of the reasons why. I mean, this fragmentation issue is real. The rule set really, really, really matters down to the level of detail. Incentives don't necessarily favor tech adoption. It's a very conservative industry, unless they do, which means somebody comes along and does a good job of writing the rule set in such a way that it favors them, which does happen from time to time. Risk aversion in the industry is really quite pervasive. And the other thing is that for new technology, the influence at state capitals is asymmetric. I can promise you, as a former regulator, that the utility can put somebody on a regulator's doorstep and a member of the legislature's doorstep 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, whereas a new technology company doesn't have that capability. The politics and the business are played with very sharp elbows. $1 billion a day. There's a lot at stake, right? So I end with my two major points, and I hope I haven't sped through this too fast. No, I'm about right. I think we're at a point of having to take some moral leadership and technological leadership on environmental issues, and that a reemergence of the political center is fundamental to that opportunity. And while the characteristics of the sector are frustrating, to say the least, I think we simply must drive faster to innovation to overcome these difficulties. That's it. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you for joining us. Excellent. When you talk to the David Cranes, it seems like he understands and is on the same wavelength. What does he tell you as far as ways to make a dent in these particular issues? And then how do you see some of the political parties actually getting to be more centrist?
Yeah, I mean, those are both very vexing issues. David Crane, obviously, if you guys don't know who he is the CEO of NRG. Yeah, and I'm not sure how many people were at that particular one. I don't think it was this year. But, David is what I would call a forward-thinking CEO. And these guys are in the competitive generation business. They own retail electric providers. They're thinking very hard about solar and customer relationships. And I mean, if you think about the world and people fitting on a normal curve, right, you would think that there would be a lot of outliers, even in the utility industry, that are really excited about technology and forward-looking. But there's not that many, in my opinion. I mean, I think the curve tends to be skewed toward the less enthusiastic of that breed. David is one that I think is really forward-looking and is very thoughtful about what they're trying to do at NRG, and I think he would like to be on the leading edge of that disruption of the sector. He needs the tool set to develop, right? And you saw the declining cost of that rooftop solar. That's David's way of being able to be a 50-state competitor, right? If he can compete at the retail level in 18 states, if he can compete at the wholesale level in sort of 26 states and really all the states that matter from a population perspective, and then he can compete in 50 states by putting in direct competition with the utility a rooftop that has solar on top of it, then he's got to kind of the scale that I think he would like to get to, right? But he's got barriers all the way. 50 states all have different regulations about insurance requirements, about the types of things that are required for fire codes on top of roofs and the metering requirements and stuff. And so I think David is a forward-thinking guy. I think he has some barriers to overcome. I think that some of them will unfold naturally as a consequence of the continued decrease in solar prices. And so that is just a recipe for preaching a little bit of patience, right? 4 years we've seen this extraordinary increase in the amount of solar that's been installed. I mean, 12 gigawatts now, not insignificant. And those declining prices have been significant. At the same time, we've seen these financial innovations, right? Solar City and others that have thought about, how do we decrease the upfront cost? On your second question about the reemergence of a political middle, maybe we're having some pendulum swing in some states. I mean, I'm looking at the politics in our state right now, and I think that Senator Davis is going to lose by somewhere between 12 and 15 points. I think Senator Patrick is probably going to beat Senator Van de Putte by something similar, if not more. 70% of voters vote straight ticket. And so if you start with that as your premise of the outcome, I think it's very difficult to overcome that barrier. That's less true, I think, in some other states, and I think the only way you get the reemergence of that middle is if that vote isn't decided in the primary. and lately, especially in our state, we've trended toward really having things decided in the primary. I do think that there are a lot of thoughtful people that are thinking about how to develop a reemergence of the center right and how to develop a reemergence of the center left, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think it's likely that we're going to have 2 years of blue president and a red Senate and a red House, personally. And it's going to be an interesting couple of years to see if there are any pragmatists that emerge that are trying to solve this particular set of problems. No good answers, I'm sorry. I'm happy to try to shoot for other answers if other questions are out there. Trevor?
Any questions?
Yeah, thank you for coming. You've hit on all the topics that I like to think about and talk about. I recently had opportunity to attend the South by Southwest Eco, and there was a speaker from RMI presenting on a specific topic of battery storage costs. Mm-hmm. And the presentation was very interesting to me in that he was predicting that the battery costs would probably be dropping even faster than his most aggressive technological advancement estimates at the time the report had been produced, indicating that really utilities are putting themselves at risk by making long-term financial investments in 30, 40-year fossil fuel assets just because their customers will have a cost-effective opportunity to divorce themselves from the grid entirely.
I think there's,
so I was curious.
Well, in some ways, I think that's why I indicated in that one slide that we're in this sort of waiting period, right? It's not just a waiting period that's related to firming up the EPA rules. There's a sense of a lot of retirement, especially in the east, of older unscrubbed plants. And so there's probably some necessity for replacement of some of that retired infrastructure. But I think that's a reason why we're starting to see two things. We're starting to see some utilities try to remake the regulatory compact. We've seen it happen in Arizona recently. We've seen it happen in Georgia with Southern Company, and we've seen it happen in Minnesota. And basically what they're trying to do is set up a situation where if you do have solar rooftop, then you're going to have a per customer monthly charge. And so you've got one set of utilities that are doing that. You've got other utilities that are thinking about, all right, well, how do I get in that business? Right? How does my unregulated affiliate take advantage of being in that business? So I don't think that there is a uniform response. You have some utilities that are damn the torpedoes going ahead with Vocal, for example, right? Mississippi Power, Southern Power are obviously very busy building very big central station generation. But I think you also have utilities that are thinking about how do I adjust to that potential new reality. One set is doing a full-on, how do I get my regulator to interfere on my behalf? Another set is doing this, how do I get into the business? And I think a third set is sort of trying to defer investment while those things settle out. I can tell you that I think that the press is over-reporting the cost of storage and that the actual storage numbers are below what is being reported out there right now.
Excellent. Okay. So your recommendation of those three paths, so I mean, do you have a recommendation for your utility? I am in favor of more competition rather than less. And if the regulated industry wants to roll into the business of being a provider of solar power and end-use customers ultimately get the price and type of service that they want, I'm all for that. What I dislike is people or utilities trying to raise barriers to entry. And so I get offended, quite frankly, when a utility tries to, and Austin Energy does this, by the way, I get offended by these barriers to entry that are artificially created by regulators, even though I'm a former regulator. And so there's very real issues for the utility business model, and I don't think that we should try to create an army of unhealthy utilities. I think that's a bad outcome. On the other hand, I would rather steer them toward helping them make themselves healthy through being a competitor, maybe in a non-incumbent area, for example, than steer them in the direction of trying to erect barriers to entry. Yes, sir. It's all people of a certain age asking questions here. I don't know if you've noticed this. I'm expecting you next. No offense.
I'm offended by that comment because I'm older than Matt. But anyway, it seems to me that a lot of what you said is snapshots of what exists now. And, the fact that we don't have a national energy policy seems to be, I'm trying to be objective, seems to be the purview of a particular party, your party. I think that your party represents the conventional energy industry who doesn't have much of an economic interest right now in disruptive technology, and therefore the so-called externalities, which are really subsidies, make some of these things very, very difficult to do. Our country has always used policy positions to move the country in a way that seems to be in the best interest of everyone, or the most people. Home ownership, very few people would bemoan the intention of policy to direct average citizens to become homeowners. And right now, by ignoring the risks of the climate issues, conventional hydrocarbon generation is effectively holding a market, what would otherwise be a market-driven initiative, at bay. And it's taken, many people would say that the solar industry is already at grid parity if the $80 million a day that the United States government uses to send the Navy out to protect shipping lanes for fossil fuels, the countless subsidies that this industry receives.
There's a question in there somewhere.
My question is, how in the world will political centerism, ever come about when people have a financial interest in keeping it as it is, in spite of what's maybe in the best interest of the planet?
It's a hard question, and it's a thoughtful question. There are vested interests on all sides of this issue, right? There are vested interests on the side of those that would be disruptive. I don't think that the issues are crystal clear as you've described them, that there is a drill, baby, drill mentality that permeates the side of this issue that's red, and that there is an aggressive growth of new technology related to energy that is pervasive on the blue side of this equation. In fact, I think it's more opportunistic than that, honestly. So in 2005, the governor and I went up to Southern Methodist University, and he and I met with 30 different providers of wind generation, both developers and manufacturers. And what he said at the time was, if you'll bring it, we'll bring it. And we ended up doing a fairly significant transmission build-out, in effect, to try to capture that untapped resource in West Texas. When I look at the political ads that are running nationally, there's a gentleman in Colorado, arguably a very purple state, who has a big R behind his name, but he's running very pro alternative energy, wind energy ads. And so I don't think the lines are quite as stark maybe as you've driven them. Drawn them? But I will say that as a general proposition, both sides get kind of pigeonholed and aggressively treated as if they adopt that position. But I'm here to tell you that I have an R behind my name, and I am highly supportive and have been highly supportive and have demonstrated support through policy action for certain alternative technologies. And I think you'll find that in Louisiana, Mary Landrieu, who has a D behind her name, is running all of these ads up here, distancing herself as fast as she can from this administration. And so I sort of challenge the notion, one, that there's sort of this uniformity of policy position that's adopted by policymakers, and if you have an R, you've got to be over here, and if you have a D, you've got to be over here. Now, that's a different issue than how do you get a center to reassert itself. And I think that center reasserting itself is a much more difficult issue. I think it calls for a lot of political courage by those that have a position and don't run away from it to be opportunistic just because they've seen a shift in the political tea leaves, as it were. And that happened here, right? The governor of Texas was for wind energy before he was against it. And it's a testament to how the electorate in the state moved, and he moved with it. And so I think what it takes to redevelop that political middle is people kind of standing on principle and being willing to get voted out of office based on their position. And if you get enough of them, perhaps you get some leadership in that central area. But it's a vexing problem. I mean, again, he was shaking his head. I don't think he agreed with me on that about primary voting and the percentage of people that vote in primaries is relatively low, but it's really driving a lot of elections right now, and it's driving a lot of outcomes that I think are extreme on both sides. And so, I'm looking at the vote totals over the past few days of early voting here in Texas, and we're way down from where we were for obvious reasons in 2012, but we're up a bit from where we were in 2010. So, maybe more general election participation is a way of driving that more centrist position, because I think there are a lot of swing voters that can help drive that middle and that voice. Best answer I got, man. Sorry. What else?
Hi. I'm going to go ahead and break the trend. But,
Thank you, young man.
My question is, you speak a lot about innovation. What are your specific ideas for creating like that innovative atmosphere within the U.S.? And do you think it's more of like we need to have policy to align us to specific ideas, or do we need more deregulation for entrepreneurial spirits?
I'm kind of in the all of the above camp. The sheet I put up there asked that very question: is innovation an imperative? Is innovation a result of almost market interference in your chosen technology? Is innovation just sort of a natural occurrence that's created by a particular value of an idea? And I think there's room for all of those types of things. My argument would be a bit like this. We ought to do everything that we can to be as disruptive as possible, because disruption causes entities to have to adjust. And so whether you value your local utility or you don't value your local utility, and I think they do an extraordinary job all over the country serving customers, pressuring a group of executives to think in new ways and forcing them to adjust to disruption is part of how you get the ecosystem overall to move. And so I think there are some specific ways where you can create disruption, and clearly in the late 90s in the U.S. and a lot of states that the methodology we used was to try to open retail markets. Advanced meters, 56 million nationally, we're headed toward roughly, and we have 6.5 million out here. Giving information to end-use customers is a way of trying to be disruptive by virtue of creating new demands from that customer base for services and creating new pressures on the utility to be responsive to provide services. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can try to create that ecosystem. There are a lot of folks that give a lot of credence to the idea of this cluster building. And Denver's got the Enosphere, for example, where they're trying to bring a lot of very entrepreneurial companies and squeeze them into space together on the theory that they'll create something that's greater than the individual company. San Francisco obviously has a lot of that type of activity in Silicon Valley as well. Part of the issue in my mind isn't that there aren't a tremendous number of ideas. It's just this industry is an industry of such scale that to get over that sort of chasm between startup And actually being able to effectuate change takes enormous patience. And I'll give an example that I gave at the outset to a couple of the guys I was talking to. So you guys may have heard of this company, Overpowering, that does behavioral-based energy efficiency modification. And this company started out as sort of two guys with a briefcase in 2007. I remember they came through my office at the time and they said, hey, we got this idea. You know what people respond to in energy efficiency? They respond to how they're doing relative to their neighbor. If you tell them that they're doing worse than their neighbor, they want to get better. And they started out by sending paper bills that had smiley faces or frowny faces on them. It was that simple as a business plan. And, they IPO'd last year and have done, fairly well. And it remains to be seen whether they're going to go to sort of national scale. They sort of have 95 or 96 utility customers, which is not bad. But I think that there is a real chasm between that sort of startup and getting to scale. And I think that's where we have to work that problem, is creating a supportive atmosphere to help cross that boundary between good idea and getting to scale. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Just to go off of that and talking a little more about removing barriers to market entry, I guess. We've seen in Austin how the citizens and sort of local leaders are taking the initiative to, especially in transportation with respect to Uber and Lyft and things like that, to remove some of the barriers. Considering players like Sanjevity who are approaching the customers directly in Rooftop Solar and offering immediate returns on their investment, do you see a similar sort of grassroots revolution happening in Rooftop Solar where it comes from the citizens asking to remove?
It's interesting, right, because there was just this task force report that came out just weeks ago that Austin Energy was forced to respond to. It's kind of an election imperative, right? Chris Riley said, I want to be greener because that's how I'm going to beat my opponent in this race. And they rolled out this I think it's 50% renewable energy by X date. I don't remember what it was. And it forced the utility to respond immediately. And they came back with, well, let's shut the Fayette plant down and let's build a plant out at Decker, and let's come back with an initiative to do some solar, right? And so there was action response. And in some ways, it's exactly the type of thing that you're talking about. This one happened to be, rather than sort of Uber and Lyft grassroots demand, it was kind of calculated, I think, around the election a bit. But this has happened in Uber and Lyft's case, and I think there's still some insurance requirements that the city has put on them and stuff, so still some barriers. And I think it is happening on that side of things. But Austin Energy has been pretty successful at playing a little bit of defense on this as well. And I think there's still a lot of confusion amongst customers. Uber and Lyft are easy, right? I can take a cab or I can call somebody with my my app on my phone, and I can get from point to point, A to B, for $10. One or the other. One's going to come instantaneously. I'm going to be in somebody's car. It's a no cool thing. I'm going to do that. Whereas solar's different, right? I got to think about, all right, am I going to be in this house this long? Am I going to have a significant upfront cost, or can I finance at least this thing? It's a much more complicated transaction to engage in as an end-use customer. And so I think it's harder for it to arise from that sort of grassroots place. It doesn't exactly look like that pretty easy transaction that really doesn't cost me as a consumer much. I'm just trying to get from point A to point B. I got guys running around on my rooftop. They're putting holes in my rooftop. I don't know how long I'm going to have the house. And it's just a bigger decision. So there's barriers on the utility side, but there's also customer barriers that I think are affecting that issue a bit. I thought I saw somebody else. Yes, ma'am. Is this the first female voice that we've heard the entire time?
Probably the first Australian as well.
Ah, awesome.
I'm wondering if you can comment on one of your slides. You had a whole list of technologies that you said it was quite encouraging to see that they were being developed. But to me, that presents more of a portfolio approach than we perhaps need, given the time aspect of climate change. I wonder if you can comment on the role of government to focus some of those efforts.
Okay, let me say two things. One, let me put a disclaimer around that slide. Really, I wasn't endorsing any of those technologies. I was just suggesting that they were reasons to have some optimism about the sector, okay? That there were things that are happening in all of those. And by the way, Australian electric markets, love them. I think that the market's right, no capacity market, really high critical peak pricing. Very interesting what's going on there. I think that's what's happening with 111D, isn't it? Isn't that what the Obama administration is basically doing? They basically said, look, states, figure out how to solve this particular problem. Get to X level of reduction in emissions. Here's the 4 buckets of choices we recommend, but you don't have to necessarily choose these 4 buckets. You can choose other buckets if you'd rather choose another bucket. The word energy efficiency is mentioned in the draft rule 248 times. I think nuclear is mentioned twice, right? So there's some things in there going on, right? But I think they have tried to give states the flexibility under that rule to act with some speed, to choose flexibly what the state choice ought to be, and thus the favorable one out of that list that I presented up there. And some states will go one direction, some states will go another, but I think the answer to your question is that seems directionally to be where the federal government is. I think some state governments are not going to respond to that rule at all. I think the rule has some real issues with it. I'll give you an example. If a state files a SIP that the feds reject, and the feds say they're going to put in place a FIP, a federal implementation plan, does that then mean that the feds now have purview over the energy efficiency funding stream, which is at the distribution level, which has always been a state authority? Does that mean the feds then have authority over the renewable portfolio standard in an individual state, which again is something that's traditionally been part of the state purview? And so I don't want to tell you that I, by this presentation, endorse all of the aspects of that rule, but I do think what they've tried to do is give states exactly that direction, which is choose your poison. Here's some ideas we have. Bring your best ideas forward and favor those things that you think work in your state. Our state wind works pretty good. Arizona solar works pretty good. So that, I guess, is my short answer to your question. Yes, ma'am?
So back to energy efficiency. I'm working with a group that's doing small-scale CHP. So they'd put a little natural gas generator next to a building or a dorm, something like this, and make, 150 kilowatts, 200 kilowatts.
Love it.
With natural gas. But then use the waste heat to either run an absorption chiller to make the hot water for the building, to just dehydrate the air and make their existing air conditioners work more efficiently. Now in Texas, we don't consider waste heat as a renewable energy, but you're taking a 35% efficient system and making it 95% efficient, running the same amount of gas, but then you're getting all these extra benefits.
The solar and the wind folks have better lobbyists than you do.
They do.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what's going on there, right? I mean, there is a CHP coalition that's tried to participate at the ledge over time. And they just haven't been able to kind of raise the volume level. But yeah, the CHP is a great example. And Texas was an early adopter of CHP, and it's fabulous technology, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah, and if we know for example, we know the owner of Embassy Suites, but it's the barriers to entry to cross state lines, to cross ISOs, to cross even it's too much trouble.
I know, it's a hard business. It is.
It gives a lot of people jobs.
So what about finding some common ground? If we don't want either the sides or any of the sides to compromise their principles, but finding some common ground, it seems like a decent vision to have the ability to tax things we're concerned about and then make more efficient the tax code in other regions. So radical tax reform, the corporate and personal income taxes, and then implement a carbon tax and make it revenue neutral. Do you see any hope of that, even though it seems so logical, actually being some common ground that gets some traction in the next few years?
Did you go to that Kip Averett forum that happened back at the Paramount here a few weeks ago?
What's that?
Did you go to the Kip Averett forum that happened a few weeks ago at the Paramount? There's at least one person that was here. There was actually a guy, and I didn't really think that much of it, but there was a guy up there that styled himself as ultra-conservative. I don't know how he styled himself, but he proposed exactly that, right? He said, let's use taxation to reduce the things we don't want. And I think maybe that the sun has set on that opportunity in the near term. But you never say never. I think these ideas come back, and we'll see.
We're out of time. Let's thank Paul again.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.